Hey everyone, hi, welcome back to my channel. My name is Shelly and today I am going to talk you through 5 of my absolute favorite nonfiction reads. Now if you're new to my channel, then hello, welcome again. My name is Shelly and I love books and reading, and lately I've been tiptoeing my way into a couple of fashion videos. So if you like sort of eclectic videos that talks about the love of life in the form of books and in the form of fashion, I would encourage you to subscribe, stick around, and without any further ado, let's go ahead and get into the meat of this video. If you're watching this in November, then I am doing this in celebration of Nonfiction November, which is a month-long event hosted by Olive at a Book Olive, talking about and celebrating nonfiction reading. And so I think I'm going to go, because I like a tiny bit of structure in all of my videos, I'm going to go from most emotional to most academic. And when I mean emotional, I mean the book that broke me, that made me cry. I had all the feelings when I read this, and that would be Stag's Leap by Sharon Olds. This is a poetry collection in which she talks about the demise, the falling apart of her marriage, and what that meant to her. And it's a deep dive into her thinking about this time in her life when her life was being deconstructed. In a sense, it's like this self-implosion moment. And she is known as a confessional poet, and boy was this confessional. And it was so good. It was just so good. It was so jaw-droppingly honest that I almost couldn't believe that she was sharing with us in the way that she was. Just this vulnerability and this honesty that was all throughout the book. And so if you end up liking or have read Stag's Leap, this is just bonus recommendations. I also went on to read Satan Says, which is more about her childhood, Sharon Olds' childhood, with incredibly difficult parents, to say the least. And then also The Living and the Dead. And as the title would suggest, it is about grief and mourning, and it's about a lot of stuff, but it does talk about what death means and what it meant to her, and in some ways some particular deaths that she ended up living through. And so all three, like Sharon Olds is a favorite through and through, but I would definitely say if you haven't read any of Sharon Olds, start with Stag's Leap, or if you just haven't read Stag's Leap, this is incredible. So good. So good. I've scooted to the side because the next book I only have in digital form, and if we're going from most emotional to most academic, this is another emotional read, and it is Dear Sugar by Cheryl Strayed. So Cheryl Strayed, I've made several videos, or I've made a deep dive into Cheryl Strayed's career. So if you're interested in how Dear Sugar came about, which is a really interesting and fascinating story, I will leave that video linked down below. But the long short of it is that Cheryl Strayed, the writer, was writing a column for an online literary journal called The Rumpus. The writers would write in with their issues, and she would write back with some advice. And unlike a normal advice columnist, which does things sort of by the etiquette book, there's, books on etiquette, and the advice columnist typically would reference an etiquette book and give advice based on what is socially acceptable. And what Cheryl Strayed does is that she breaks down that wall between the letter writer and herself. And so what Cheryl Strayed does, and she did this anonymously at the time, and then she came out as Dear Sugar later on, but she would share something about her own life that she felt like would connect herself to the letter writer. So if the letter writer was talking about grief, Cheryl Strayed would talk about some of the most trying times in which she had to struggle with grief in her own life. And it's more of like a non-traditional memoir than anything, because you learn so much more about Cheryl Strayed and her childhood and her life through the answers to these letters. And it ends up being really touching, and she really gets to the nitty-gritty of our own selves and our inner lives. And I just love it. I think it's her best work out there. Even though her most known work is her memoir, Wild. I just love Tiny Beautiful Things. Did I say Dear Sugar? I meant Tiny Beautiful Things. All right, we're gonna move on from that. Next up is a book that occupies a very special place in my heart because I read it in college and then I reread it last year, and I love it so much. And it is Mouse by Art Spiegelman. This is volume 1 and volume 2. Both, together they're slim works and they're graphic novels, so they won't take you but a moment to read. And boy, these are really good. Art Spiegelman is trying to tell his father's story, who was a Jew. His father was a Jew who ended up living through a concentration camp experience. Horrific, terrible. And what's interesting is that in a lot of ways, I think I like things that are non-traditional, because Cheryl Strayed breaking that wall between the letter writer and the advice giver, Art Spiegelman, is breaking down the struggle as a writer and a son trying to tell his own father's story. So it gets a little bit meta, especially in the second book. And it's so good. It's depicted, the Jews in the book are depicted as mice, and the Germans are depicted as cats. And that it just works really well. It's so good. And there were certain points in this book, especially when I read it as a younger person, that really made my stomach churn. And it was just a super impactful read. It's about survivor's guilt and father-son relationships and what it means to live with somebody that's difficult to understand. And oh, it's so good. It's just so good, y'all. Next up, we're gonna be hanging out outside because my next favorite is gonna be Pilgrim at Tinker Creek by Annie Dillard. This is her meditation on nature, and she is such a lovely observer of the natural world. And that's what this is. She spends, I think, a year at Tinker Creek, which is, I wouldn't say isolated from human society, but is remote. She's living in a remote place. And from there, she really gets to think about bugs. Love me some bugs. She's thinking about the randomness of the natural world. And in a lot of ways, she gets a bit metaphysical. I like that. I like that. I like her thinking. I like the way that she ties it into what she's seeing. And I just thought it was such a beautiful meditation on nature. And then finally, my most academic read, but really touched me when I read it. And it was Catherine the Great by Robert K. Massey. This is about the Russian Tsaress, who is an incredible leader. And it is the biography of her life. I mean, it's so good. It's hard to explain. But I think here's the deal. I'm trying to make sure there's no glare. Here's the deal with this book. If you know nothing about Russian history, and you're trying to, if you have a mild, even the mildest of curiosities about Russia, and what's the deal with them Russians? If you're I don't get it. I feel like this is such a fantastic introduction to Russian history, because he's so good at tying things together and rounding out the bigger picture painting the bigger picture, rounding out the sharp edges. And so he'll be telling you something or showing you something what it means to be a female leader for the Russians. And he'll also give context as to what that means both for the past and for the future. And then so in a lot of ways, it was such a fantastic and enjoyable and pleasurable reading experience, because in no way was he talking down in this way where he's in case you don't know what it means to be a female leader in Russia, then here, let me tell you. It's more of in the context of Russian history, this is where Catherine's reign sits, both, for their past, leading up to her reign, and then also for her future. But also as a, I mean, so that's contextually, like, that's what he does as a writer, and it's really good. He's also a very entertaining writer. He definitely can leave you on some cliffhangers, and he's, you know, there's just these moments where you're just like, oh, what is going to happen next? You know, it takes a good writer to do that. But also for Miss Catherine herself, she's just a really fascinating figure. She's super interested in art and science and furthering the country. Politically, she did some really fantastic things. And the way that she comes to rule Russia is super, super interesting. It was fantastic. It's so good. So this is it's a big book, but it's super readable. And I would encourage anybody to read this. It's just, for a book that seems like it would be really intimidating both subject-wise and length-wise, it's just incredibly readable. So that's it. Those are 5 books plus a few. I'm going to scoot back to the center. 5 nonfiction books that I absolutely love. I'm so glad that I was able to share them with you today. Of course, share your favorites. 5 or more or 1, I don't care. Just tell me your favorite nonfiction books of late. Of course, my list seems like it's always changing, always adapting, always growing based on like what I've read and what I've consumed. And I even feel like there are a couple of books that I'm reading right now that might overthrow some of the books that I've just shown you. So, you know, it's always this organic list that moves and warps with time and with my own education, and I love that. You know, I love that about reading. So share with me your favorites of the moment. I would love to know and to figure, you know, I'd love to take some recommendations. My goodness, Shelly, end the video. So thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. And I will see you all in my next one.